Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast and of counsel at the Com Law Group. And I am here to welcome you to this exciting Broadband Breakfast live online discussion that will focus on the topic of multiple dwelling units or multi-tenant environments. I've heard so many names for them, I'm not quite sure which is the best, but thank you for our panelists, which I will introduce just now. We want to use a current proceeding that is before the FCC that is into or is addressing this question. It's called Wireline Competition Bureau seeks to refresh record on improving competitive broadband access to multi-tenant environments. So we're going to start with that, but we will not stop with that. We're going to make sure we talk about an array of topics pertaining to, as we laid it out in the discussion here, when Greenfield fiber meets Brownfield multiple dwelling units. And that's a bit jargonese, which is against our general policy. We don't like to use jargon. We want to explain it, make broadband topics accessible for the average user. And so by Greenfield, we mean the notion of building fiber out to new homes or new apartment units is kind of attractive because you're not really dealing with legacy equipment. But this is where Brownfield comes in when there's already some type of connection, be it DSL or cable or otherwise to units. You're talking about retrofitting, you're talking about digging to install fiber. Well, when you're getting to a multiple dwelling unit, there's a lot more than just bringing fiber to the premises, right? Bringing fiber to the unit or the terminal on the outside of the house. There's inside wiring. And so this is why the MDU space raises a number of additional questions. And let me just back up a second and say, here at Broadband Breakfast, we're all about better broadband, better lives. We want to make sure we help provide the tools and materials that people need to get higher capacity broadband and to make use of it. And so we talk about both the infrastructure and the applications and use, as well as issues like privacy, Section 230, and other issues that come out. In fact, in coming weeks on Broadband Breakfast Live Online, we're going to be talking about issues of supply chain, issues of social media and Section 230, and privacy. So we're going to talk about some of those other topics in the next few weeks. But for now, today, October 27th, we are focusing on this topic, and I very much encourage you to bring your questions to this discussion. One final point before we kick off the discussion, I just want to give a shout out to our sponsors. We appreciate our sponsors and their participation. Just sharing with you right now, Utopia Fiber, Lit Communities, Broadband Now, Broadband.money, Samsung Electronics America, Render Networks, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. We're very grateful for each of them and appreciate how that their support allows us to do these programs every week. So with that, let me open our view up to all of the panelists here, and let's go ahead introducing each of them in turn in the order in which they will speak for us here. I want to turn to Kevin Donnelly. Kevin is the Vice President of Government Affairs, Technology and Strategic Initiatives with the National Multifamily Housing Council. And Kevin will kick us off in just a moment after I introduce the others. Next will be Jenna Leventoff, who is the Senior Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge, a very important and now very prominent because the founder of your organization, Gigi Sohn, who is widely known, great friend to many in the broadband industry, has just been appointed one of the commissioners at the FCC. So congratulations to all at Public Knowledge for that announcement and appointment yesterday. Following Jenna, we'll hear from Sandy Howe. Sandy's the board director and chair of special committee at Minim, and she'll be able to tell us a little bit about Minim and its role in this space. And then batting cleanup will be Pierre Trudeau, President and Chief Technology Officer of Positron Access. Pierre and I did a very a nice and short interview that we linked to the Broadband Breakfast. We'll link it to this page after the event. And we talked a little about Positron Access and the role it plays in this MDU, MTE space. So with that, let's go ahead and turn it over to you, Kevin. Kick us off. Tell us a little bit about who the National Multifamily Housing Council is and your stake in this particular proceeding that we've teed up here.
Sure. Thanks, Drew. It's good to be with fellow panelists and all of you here today. I appreciate the opportunity to get in front of this audience. NMHC, as many of you know, is the National Multifamily Housing Council. We're the trade group that represents owners, operators, developers of apartment communities across the country. And then, at least in speaking today about the ongoing FCC proceeding, we're the lead group behind a coalition of real estate associations ranging from public and nonprofit, for-profit operators of affordable and conventional housing, retail, and commercial property owners. So really speaking on behalf of the breadth of the commercial and, as the FCC likes to call it, the multi-tenant environment. And here today, I think, as Jenna will also speak to, it's been a busy couple of weeks at the FCC. Both our groups have had our hands full in filing on a proceeding that Drew mentions. That really, there's a lot at stake, and it dovetails nicely with the rest of our conversation today about how to get fiber and overall connectivity to millions of Americans, millions of properties across the country. Last week we filed what we believe are data-driven comments with evidence that shows that the market, the existing structure, partnership-based model that exists today is working. It's serving multifamily residents in particular well. Our industry was able to collect data that shows about 79% of apartment properties do have competition and choice on site. And the commercial and retail sectors are also well served. And I think, all across that spectrum, the multi-tenant environment, we have seen the network collectively tested throughout the pandemic, and by and large, we have fared well. I will acknowledge that if and where we talk about a market failure, it really is at that lower end of the spectrum, low-income properties, smaller properties, affordable or just properties where the economics of a provider coming in and deploying infrastructure can be challenging. And in those spaces, it's also challenging for the property owner, to carry that expense as well. So there's certainly a lot at stake. I'm looking forward to Pierre and Sandy talking more on the infrastructure side and how maybe there's some new solutions that can come to bear to help us ultimately achieve our shared goal, which is ensuring everyone, regardless of where they live, have access to high quality, high speed broadband.
Kevin, you're just a little too brief here. Let me invite you to elucidate a little bit more on this proceeding and this context. So when we were chatting a little earlier, you were saying this is the third foray in a few years that the FCC has ventured into this space. To talk just a little bit about that, maybe you want to mention this controversy about San Francisco ordinance that came up and how that ties in. If you have any thoughts on that, Kevin, just to kind of make sure we have a good round out understanding, at least from your perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I was trying to be brief though, as to give time for the others, but I'll happily give a little bit more background. So the current proceeding at the FCC, looking at competition and the state of the market in the multi-tenant environment, is essentially the third review of our space since 2017. This has been an active area for the commission historically, and I'd say over the past decade or so, there's been a willingness by our industry and by the commission to hear each other out and to have an ongoing dialogue. I think in both the 2017, 2019 proceedings, and then really leading up to today, the commission's looking at how ultimately property owners and broadband providers or communications providers interact, what types of agreements they're entering into, and how those are benefiting residents or commercial and retail tenants. In particular, they're very curious about the impact of revenue share or infrastructure cost share agreements, particularly interested in the impact of wiring agreements, marketing agreements, and then overall access agreements. All four of those, we believe, are key tools for ensuring that the multi-tenant environment is highly competitive, that our property owners are able to lure providers in when possible, so that they can serve the properties. And then ultimately, I think give the property owner an ability to control access and make sure that their asset is protected and their residents in the multifamily space are receiving the highest level of service possible. And then I think there's a question that the FCC is exploring again, and it's on the topic of mandatory access. There, I think we have been embroiled in proceedings at the FCC going back to about 2017, where it was actually the city government passed a mandatory access ordinance.
In San Francisco, you're not speaking
in San Francisco, about. Yeah. That proceeding was actually, there was a petition filed by a collection of broadband providers who said that the proceeding needed to be preempted by the FCC. Ultimately, the FCC allowed much of that law to stand, but did strike down the mandatory sharing of wire, because there are hyper-technical reasons why wiring share is a problem and ultimately harms consumers. It harms the service that is received by residents or commercial tenants. So we were grateful for that limited preemption, but we do believe that mandatory access writ large is the wrong policy. Mandatory access ordinances, we just saw one passed by the Oakland city government just last week. We believe it's ultimately not achieving or not serving the population they claim to be serving. In many cases, what we will see is broadband providers, a select few of them, will use mandatory access ordinances to gain entry into properties that already are well served, that already have high levels of competition or high levels of service, while leaving lower income, affordable, smaller properties unserved or with substandard service. And that is where I think we need to really put our focus. The digital divide here in Washington, and I think across the country, is really often talked about in a binary way, where broadband service exists and where it doesn't. But in reality, the challenge is much more complicated. In urban or suburban, low income and workforce or middle income housing, where broadband service does exist, adoption can be impacted by a variety of things, such as affordability or often the quality of service. And so when we take a step back, and I think it dovetails with our conversation a little bit about getting fiber and higher levels of service to all types of MDUs, you end up having to grapple with the fact that we have an aging infrastructure stock inside of our buildings. And to do that, we're going to need to work together to put forward some pretty cutting edge solutions that are both cost effective and can work for both sides of the equation.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. And of course, I did ask you to go on longer there. So thank you for explaining that. I think that gives additional context. So yeah. Jenna, tell us why everything Kevin said is wrong.
That's what I was going to say. Yes, everything Kevin said, we pretty much don't agree with. No personal offense, Kevin. So I think public knowledge, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a DC-based nonprofit, and we focus on protecting consumers in the tech and telecom space. And part of that is making sure that everyone across the country has access to affordable communications tools. And we see that this issue is very much an issue about affordability. In general, our nation has a huge lack of competition in the marketplace. As of a couple of years ago, 70% of consumers across the country have a maximum of 2 broadband providers, and around 30% have just 1 broadband provider. And I think that's why broadband in the US is some of the most expensive in the world. And you would think that there would be a competitive marketplace in a lot of multi-dwelling units because there's a dense population, and a lot of times these units are The bigger ones are in cities where, you would think it would be profitable to serve from an ISP perspective. There's a lot of ISPs that want to get into these buildings and can't because of these exclusive agreements. So, I think most people know here, the background is that the FCC outlawed exclusive agreements a couple of years ago, but landlords, ISPs, they found loopholes. If you search the internet, if you talk to people, talk to someone in a local apartment building, if you talk to enough, I'd say if you talk to 10 people, I can guarantee you at least one of them will say that they only have one internet provider available to them, and it's not the one that they want. I'm totally making up that statistic, but I have talked to many people. I had this issue myself, actually, when I first moved to Washington, D.C. I moved into an apartment building and I could only get Comcast, and I really wanted Verizon because Verizon at the time had fiber and Comcast didn't. And I didn't have that choice. And when I found out why, I was pretty livid, which is why I've taken up this issue at Public Knowledge. But suffice to say, we think it's really important that there's competition in these marketplaces. And even if you don't have exclusive agreements, if you can get around it in these ways that create de facto exclusive agreements, we're preventing competition and we're keeping prices up. I think that's also part of the reason why the White House has taken this on. A lot of you might have seen that President Biden talked about this issue in his executive order a couple months ago. He sees this as key to making sure that everyone can get broadband and helping to make sure that it's affordable. So when Public Knowledge filed on this issue in the docket last week, we said a couple things, pretty much the exact opposite of what Kevin said. We think that it's really important that the FCC bans not just exclusive agreements, but any agreement that has the impact of being exclusive, whether that's the ones that they talk about here, such as revenue sharing or exclusive marketing agreements, all of those, but anything else, like bulk billing at times has been used to create an exclusive environment in multi-tenant buildings. And I am sure there's loopholes that we haven't even thought of yet that will come into existence if the FCC narrowly bans these three. So we really want a broad rule that says if this has the impact of creating an exclusive agreement in a multi-unit building, it's gone. We think it's also really important to have a sort of rocket docket. So that would adjudicate these violations in the event that one of them, if someone comes up with some new workaround that may or may not clearly violate the FCC's rules, there's a quick way to figure it out. And we also have talked about the importance of mandatory access to wiring. So, I see different stats on how effective that is. In 2019, the FCC's Office of Economics and Analytics found that if there's a mandatory access law, there's an increase of 2.4 percentage points of the households that have internet access at home. Our digital divide is pretty big and every percentage counts. So 2.5 percentage increase to me is saying that these mandatory access laws are making broadband more affordable and helping people get connected. And that's the evidence that I'm seeing about how they're helpful. And that's why we have suggested them in our comments. And, I think it's also one thing we noted that I think gets looked over a little bit is multi-dwelling units. They're apartment buildings, they're condos, but they're also office buildings. And there's a lot of really special use cases here for businesses especially in terms of network resiliency. So a lot of businesses intentionally need to have multiple networks so that if one goes down, they still have another. It's really critical. They'll probably need it for their credit card machines or taking orders, placing orders, everything. And so we do want to make sure that any rules protect both residential and business. And we want to make sure that we think about the specific business use cases here about why things might be different. Also, you would think that a large business might have more marketing power. Let's say there's a chain, I'm thinking Whole Foods. Maybe they want to have an agreement with an ISP for all of the Whole Foods in a state. They can't do that if the particular shopping center that they're in has an exclusive agreement, and that's going to keep their prices up as well. So, that's something to think about, is that these agreements are not helpful. Hopefully that's enough to.
And let me just ask you one quick follow-up. So could you, earlier, just a moment ago, Kevin identified kind of the big four, or, they are, revenue agreements, cost sharing agreements, marketing agreements, wiring agreements. From your perspective and interpretation, so to speak, Jenna, which of these have already been banned, or like what is the state of restrictions on exclusive agreements between a multiple dwelling unit owner and ISPs?
So all that the FCC has outright banned are actual contracts that say provider A is the only provider that can offer internet service in this building. Those are the only things that have been banned. All these other types of agreements have popped up as a sort of workaround against that FCC ruling. So, you know, when people do one thing that's pretty common is an internet service provider will give kickbacks to a landlord. They'll say, hey, if 80% of your residents sign up for our service, we'll give you 10% of our profits. And what that incentivizes the landlord to do is say, well, if I let in another provider, I'm not going to hit that 70, 80% threshold, and then I'm not going to get any profits. So I'm only letting this one provider in. And this is the provider that gives me the biggest percentage of kickbacks. A smaller ISP that's not going to give me as much money, like, why would I let them in? That's not profitable for me. So they created this workaround. It's not technically an exclusive agreement, but the landlord doesn't have to open up their doors to other providers if they don't want to. And so they use this as an excuse to not. We've also seen a lot of instances of there will be an agreement that doesn't say that only one ISP can serve a community, but it does say only one ISP can advertise. So that in and of itself is kind of problematic because a lot of the smaller companies will tell you, no one knows we exist until we have an event in the building. And then they sign up with us because then they know that we exist. But there's a lot of reports about buildings and building managers that read these and they just don't quite understand that it's only about marketing. And so they're, overly conservative. They read it as being an exclusive agreement, period, and enforce it that way, even though that's not actually what it says, even though it's not actually breaking the law. So none of these things have been outright banned by the FCC. I think of them all as loopholes.
I'm sure Kevin will want to respond, but I'm going to resist. Kevin, just hold on to your questions, debates. We will come to them. Let's hear from Sandy Howe. Tell us a little bit about Minim. Tell us a little bit about your take on this debate and I guess workarounds. Maybe that's not the right word now, but what are some other solutions for getting higher capacity broadband to MDUs? And then let's hear likewise from Pierre, get his thoughts, and then we'll round robin it to a broader discussion. So go ahead, Sandy. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Drew. So Minim creates intelligent connectivity products in the home and that are sold at retail under the Motorola brand. So think about modems, gateways, high-speed wireless routers, mesh systems. And, there's a lot, Minim works with a lot of the cable broadband, so it allows customers to go buy their products at retail to connect to the cable broadband. And having been in the cable broadband industry for almost 30 years now, I'm very proud of an industry that, one, we have 1 gigabit service to most homes in their footprints today. So this is a huge speed benefit, and it looks like we're going into another round of speed wars as 5G is being more widely deployed and there's more devices available, as well as there's rumbles from the telcos of more fiber to the home. The other thing the industry has done that has been very impressive is during the COVID response, the industry really leaned in. And having worked with providers all over the world, I watched where there were countries that lost internet for 24 hours. Could you imagine during COVID lockdown in March of 2020, if we didn't have internet? We wouldn't have Zoom, which we all are so dependent on today. And, our industry was great because not only did they have a system that was designed, and I know very well about all the bits and bytes of the design and why it could take the additional traffic capacity. It was designed to be able to handle that extra traffic. But the industry also measured it and reported every how they were doing in all the big cities. So we had connectivity during a time that connectivity was so important, and we had really great speeds. The industry also offers almost every operator has some sort of internet essentials kind of program for low income. So for those that qualify, you can have, these essential packages that are actually very cost effective. So again, the cable industry has really leaned in. And now what I'm very excited to be working on is everything around the 10G initiative. So how do we take these networks to 10 gigabit? And multi-dwelling units are definitely top of mind in the industry because about 25% of the footprint nationwide are these multi-tenant, multi-dwelling units. So they're important to serve and make sure they're serviced right. You can imagine with some of the age of the buildings, and I happen to live in a historic area, so buildings built, over 100 years ago are quite interesting as far as the wiring is all about. And the other thing I'm very proud about that has been working is that there's competition in these buildings. Just as Kevin said, 75% of multi-tenant have more than 2 providers. And in even larger buildings where it gets even more important with 50 or more units, 80% have choice today. So there's choice out there. And then the other piece that's interesting in this current market, from Q4 of 2019 to Q2 of 2021, we've actually seen 106% increase in buildings with 3 providers. So I would argue that everything that's in place has been working. And this becomes more important as we think about 10G and how do we get 10 gigabit. And again, as I said, these buildings are a lot of times old. It's very fortunate when you have a new building. New's easy because of course it's all wired very smartly, so it could easily allow a lot of different options. But we're looking at buildings mostly that have 2 each unit, copper, twisted pair, coax, and power. And so it's looking at technologies that can help deliver in the future and today the speeds to get that 1 gigabit and beyond to the units creatively. And I will share with you, having spent years in the networking space and in the outside plant side of the network, going over anything copper, it's very interesting, it's hard. That's why there's all these technical and logistical things to consider that the operators must consider. But nevertheless, when you are looking at so many multi-dwelling units today that have competition, we're doing it. And then it's very exciting. And I think this will help tee Pierre up next. There's some great new technologies out there and they've been adopted worldwide. I've been working in them all over the world in technologies such as G.hn that really allow you to take advantage of the 3 type of wires that are running to those buildings today to allow these high-speed competition to be offered.
And by 3 wires, Sandy, you're referring to twisted pair, coax, and power. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Pierre, over to you. Talk a little bit about the pre-2010 and the post-2010 buildings and how you view this controversy and problem that the industry has.
Yeah, thank you, Drew, and thank you, Sandy, for the great end-off. Basically, Positron is working with operators of all sizes. So we're working also with the big ones, all the tier ones. We're also working with very small ISPs that are trying to change the market dynamics in their environments. So ISPs that serve a few thousand doors. And all of them have a challenge that was raised by both Kevin and Jenna and Sandy about the difficulties in some of the older buildings and also some of the buildings where there's lower income. And sometimes we've had discussions with CFOs of these entities and say, well, it's too expensive to cover these buildings. Just trying to send a crew there, the construction work, the time it takes to get the permitting, and it's very disruptive. And the tenants will hate us because we break the building before we can kind of deal with it if we try to retrofit any kind of wiring, whether it's structured wiring or fiber. And we say, you're absolutely right. You don't need and should not even accept doing this now that there are technologies like G.hn. It's an international standard that delivers gigabit speeds on wiring that was installed 20, 30, 40 years ago. And when we talk to these, again, these same operators, their CFO likes it because the cost is no longer multiple thousands of dollars sometimes per door. It's no more than what DSL would cost or DOCSIS would cost, yet provides a lot more bandwidth, especially in the upstream direction, which is essential for sessions like this, but also for remote learning, remote working, and so on. That matters a lot to these low-income families that sometimes can't afford to take some other jobs simply because of the commute time and all that. The other thing is that the sales and marketing teams of these entities now have the ability to market their service and tailor that to buildings that were ignored before that. So that gives some freedom of choice options. At the same time, there was this, I guess, one of the point that says, well, you cannot share the wiring because that will kill existing technologies. So when you pick a given technology, whichever one is first in the building, it has kind of that de facto grandfather clause that says you're there, and if someone wants to offer service, great, as long as they don't disrupt existing subscribers. With G.hn, the technology is designed and has been successfully deployed in many scenarios where if it's on twisted pair, we can share that with the older DSL technologies also serving the building. If it's on coax, we would replace DOCSIS and provide the gigabit speeds in the upstream, not just in the downstream. But at the same time, let's call it legacy cable TV. Someone that says, well, this area is not served with IPTV, but you still need to have access to your preferred channels and whatever extra channels that cable TV does offer. It is now possible to have G.hn and that legacy cable TV from whoever has been providing the service share the same cable infrastructure. And if someone says, okay, in this building, someone says, I want to stay with DOCSIS, I'm happy with my DOCSIS-based service, and the neighbor says, well, I'd like to get more bandwidth, and G.hn is the answer, the technology used by this other choice, they can all cohabit peacefully because in most cases, although there are splitters on coax that serve, so from one feed, you serve a lot of doors. Ultimately, they all have home-run coax to a wiring closet of sort, and then that's where the splitters are, because it was convenient also to disconnect a subscriber that no longer wants a service or is not paying the bills. So we take advantage of that, where we can run alongside beyond the splitter to use different technologies and still share the overall coax infrastructure in the building. So we've given a solution to address a lot of the issues that were raised that ultimately impact pricing, impact availability of services, and choice. So now we're working with, again, some of our customers do have these exclusive agreements. Some are alternate operators trying to come in with an open access type of approach. We were talking to one of my colleagues earlier today was with a company that does community networks where they want to have open access, working with these cities. The technology is versatile and works in each of these environments. So now we change the dynamics of what became kind of a rationale for justifying, to an extent, some of these exclusive agreements. That kind of constraint goes away. So at least it's no longer a technology concern the way it was up until recently.
So wonderful. Thank you so much. The table's really been set for a discussion. I'm going to lay out three things that I think are pretty good things, or objectively good things. One of them is getting higher capacity broadband to multiple dwelling units, like let's just say moving to gigabit, higher than gigabit speeds, up and down, symmetrical, or at least closer to symmetrical. Second, competition or more choices, so that, if I live in an MDU, I'm not stuck with whoever my apartment owner, or even I guess if I'm a condo owner, even, I don't know quite exactly how all those rules work. And the third, no one's really used this term, but I want to throw it out here, which is smart buildings, smart services, right? You're having the kind of seamless things that broadband provides through your lobby, through other spaces. I mean, these are all part of the mix as I understand it. And I'd like, each of you to kind of address the frame of these. Are these in tension with one another? Let's start with Jenna, actually. Like, is it going to be attention to have, competition and have higher quality services, fiber, or do you in fact view them as going hand in hand? And what are some of your thoughts on that, Jenna?
I view them as going hand in hand. So what we've seen a lot in the past is something called digital redlining, where a lot of providers don't want to invest in low-income communities. A lot of other providers, it's their business model to explicitly invest in these low-income communities. So, I think that I just don't buy the arguments that if you have an exclusive agreement, you're more incentivized to invest. We wouldn't be having these arguments if other ISPs didn't want to invest in these buildings. They clearly do. That's why they're trying to fight this at the FCC. So,
okay. No, thanks for that. Let's kind of keep our responses brief like that. Kevin, I'm sure you have things you want to respond to from what's been said. So let's hear your response to these points.
Yeah, I think Jenna raises a lot of points. Frankly, I think need to be countered from the property owner side. I think the underpinning of this is dovetailing on what Sandy raised. Competition in the multi-tenant environment, whether it's residential or commercial, exists. We are by and large better served than the United States as a whole, and that's using the FCC's own data. We can all take issues with maybe the data that they have in hand, but whether it's the broadband speed that they have out there, 25.3, or it's the level of competition that they say exists, multifamily and multi-tenant environments are better served than those environments. And that's because of the agreements that we are able to enter into and the competition we're able to elicit. And I would just say, the number one driver for multifamily and multi-tenant environment owner is the need for seamless connectivity to make sure our residents and our commercial tenants have access to high quality, high speed broadband. That is not a nice to have. That is an absolute essential. I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it was that access to broadband was critical and no longer an amenity. It was right. A lifeline.
Kevin, put aside the facts of whether we do or don't have better higher capacity competition. Could you just address this question of why is greater investment in the networks and MDUs in tension with more competition or more players within a particular MDU space?
Well, I think, for example, I talked to an owner this morning who invests, every time they acquire a property, they're having to go in and invest $400,000 on average to upgrade and bring fiber to the unit. It sounds like there's some other more cost-effective solutions out there that our guys would love to hear about. And I think that's the key for us is, looking for tools of all kinds to make sure that we have connectivity that our residents can benefit from. And I think the reality is, going back to the current proceeding at the FCC, nothing in the existing proposals or what we assume that they are pursuing would boost deployment. Nothing would get deployment to where it's needed. And that is both in certainly in rural America, in places that just simply don't have access. But I think going back to Sandy's point on the aging infrastructure, if you look at just, for example, in the residential space, more than half of all rental units were built before 1980, and nearly a fifth of those properties were built before 1950. So just imagine the type of infrastructure that they're faced with. And the investment that's needed is not one that can be borne just by the property owner. It needs to be on the provider side too. So we need cost-effective solutions. Otherwise, it's ultimately residents and small businesses that are going to be negatively impacted.
Well, I certainly want to get Pierre and Sandy in, but Jenna, could you have a quick, concise response to that point about how do we get these really old pre-1980 buildings kind of upgraded, so to speak, without sharing the cost, so to speak, beyond just the provider stringing it out?
I zoned out for a second, admittedly, checking my email, so that's my bad. I think that there's a lot of companies that do want to make these investments. In a lot of cases, the cost of wire sharing is, it's someone owns it and someone else pays a fee to lease it out. So in that respect, you are sort of sharing the cost. If that was the question that you asked.
Right. I mean, and so are you basically saying, I mean, is public knowledge's response that all four of these things that we've outlined and mentioned briefly, you know, revenue, cost sharing, marketing, wiring agreements, are all four of them kind of like need to go, so to speak, from your view, Jenna?
Yes.
All right.
And maybe Drew, if I could just add something there. When I was explaining the technology, we are really a fiber extension. So we deliver gigabit speeds from the fiber that gets to the building, but not into the building. So that's the difference. And the one thing that allows is there's no additional wiring cost involved. So for the property owner, there's no additional investment and disruption of getting any kind of wiring changes. And the same for the operator. So the operator can come in and just install a box in the wiring closet of sort, or serve it from the outside for the smaller MDUs, and put a little modem inside the apartment, no different than what they put a Wi-Fi router, for instance. So that kind of sets aside the investment cost. And Kevin, you're right. Fiber to door is expensive. It's $600 to $800 on average per a typical MDU, the one that doesn't have anything out of the ordinary in terms of complexity. When there are issues, God forbid, asbestos in the walls, there you're talking many, many thousands of dollars per door, which kills a lot of projects and puts the rate of return so far out that does de-incentivize a lot of the operators, even the small ones that want to be aggressive. And if you avoid that element of the equation, now that changes the dynamic, and I think probably better is everyone's interest in getting broadband up to gigabit speeds to everyone.
So I guess maybe the fundamental question that I really have for Kevin and maybe Sandy as well is, what is your view on competition, on a resident's ability to have an alternative provider if they're not happy with the provider of choice of the owner of the unit? Kevin, you want to address that?
I can start.
All right, go ahead, Sandy. Go ahead. Go for it.
So, you know, there's competition today. That's the biggest thing I guess, you know, realize again from the research from the SEC, we have, you know, options in the multi-dwelling. And I cannot tell you enough from the technology side how buildings from 1980 and you know, pre are just so difficult from an infrastructure. And we have to be very careful as, you know, we're looking at the policy side of this, because the cost, if it has to be held by the building owner, those costs will be passed on to tenants. And there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be upgraded if you think about all pre-1980 buildings. And again, that's what is so exciting, in my opinion, about the cable industry and solutions, as Pierre's mentioning, because the HFC technology, the ability, whether it's fiber coming to the building, to take existing wiring in that building and deliver those speeds, it's allowing for competition. So it's there using that existing competition. And as Pierre said, it's about getting that 1 gig and beyond, and the vision is a 10 gig to all these multi-dwelling units, which we also know is making up about a quarter of the United States.
Kevin, what are, again, some of your thoughts on this question of competition and that as a good? Is it not really a good, or in this context, granted, there's competition in terms of providers, the owner of the unit can choose who they want to go with, but what about the residents of MDUs and MTEs?
Well, I think, you know, by and large, competition exists. Residents by and large have a choice, and where that is possible, our owners tend to prioritize that structure. Again, where the competition is lacking is at properties or in communities where the economics make it hard for providers to go in and do it on their own. And I think that's something where, you know, we see great potential in the Biden infrastructure plan for increased subsidy, greater build out of networks. Those are all positive things that move the needle in the right direction. But until we can move the needle on the economics of a project, that is something that property owners, whether you're a conventional or luxury property owner, commercial property owner, or more importantly, affordable or lower income property owners, they simply do not have the financial ability to carry that alone. And I think that Sandy makes a great point. You know, if a property owner is forced to carry infrastructure simply on its shoulders, it's got to go somewhere. That cost has to trickle down. And at a time of a national housing affordability crisis, I'm not sure that that's the route we want to go.
Jenna, let's get your response on kind of building out to lower income housing, public housing, and also what is your take on this San Francisco ordinance that Kevin mentioned at the top?
So, first of all, there is not currently competition. You guys can say it as much as you want. That doesn't make it true. We all know that the broadband data that does exist, that you're probably basing this off of, overestimates those people that are served by at least 40%, or by at least 40 million, not 40%. And that this is fun. I feel like I'm in like a cool debate or something. It's delightful. So there isn't currently competition. I think that the providers, the bigger providers that are owned by shareholders, by nature of what they do, they need to make money for their stock, their shareholders, right? And so by nature of that, if there's an area that they can serve that's more profitable, they're going to serve that area over the less profitable area. They could probably still make a profit in either area, but they need to maximize their profit. A lot of the smaller ISPs that aren't owned by shareholders don't have this issue. So what we see happen a lot, and we've seen this in Cleveland, we've seen this in Dallas, we've seen this in, I believe, Detroit, we've seen it in Oakland, is that providers give the best, fastest internet to the wealthiest areas because those customers are more profitable. They're going to be able to afford broadband. Low-income consumers are less able to afford broadband, although hopefully the emergency broadband benefit that most of you are probably familiar with will help that out. So some of these companies have the incentive already to serve low-income consumers, whereas some of the bigger providers don't. In terms of San Francisco, I mean, I think what we've seen there is we have providers saying that this San Francisco law has helped them get into buildings that they previously couldn't get into. So I mentioned this in our comments, but there's an ISP named Monkey Brains. They said this year alone, they got into 1,800 new units. And then Sonic has been able to access over 3,000 buildings because of this San Francisco law. So it's helping to bring competition into buildings where consumers don't like the choice of broadband provider that's available to them.
So Kevin, let's hear your reactions to this, and maybe again going back to the San Francisco. What are the specific, even if they're hyper technical, try to make them understandable. What are the problems with quote sharing wires, and are there any alternative solutions to that? And again, what is your response to this notion that there's a good that comes from competition, as shown in the San Francisco example?
Sure, I think Jenna points to two textbook examples of providers, both Sonic and Monkey Brains, who are using the mandatory access ordinance, and they claim they've gotten access to thousands of new apartment buildings or new buildings in San Francisco. But the reality is the buildings that they have gotten access to already had competition and choice and high level of service. The properties who are desperately in need of service and higher levels of service from those providers and others are the lower income, smaller, senior, affordable properties who, frankly, Jenna rightly points out that the provider can't justify the expense. And frankly, the property owner can't afford to carry the infrastructure upgrade or service upgrades that are necessary to give those residents or those commercial tenants superior service. I think when you talk about the technicalities, and I'm certainly no engineer, but both competitive providers as well as folks on the design and construction side will tell you that there are a host of technical issues with sharing of wire. And I think that's ultimately why the FCC preempted the San Francisco ordinance on that point. And I'll let people who are far smarter on technicalities weigh in there. But I will say that what I've heard anecdotally is that there are often times where two providers will come in, wires will be mistakenly cut, service is disrupted for residents or commercial tenants. Those are just some of the real world implications, but there are certainly engineering folks who can do a deeper dive on the problems of wire share.
Let's hear from Sandy and then Pierre on their reactions to this point about the sharing of wires, the sharing of infrastructure. And I'm going to add another question, which is, are there buildings that welcome kind of competition or have some kind of a conduit system that allows multiple, or is that again, not necessary because technology once brought to the home can, through G.hn, for example, share it around. So Sandy and Pierre.
So again, this wire sharing is very complex. And if you understand the nature of the data that's being transmitted, depending on the provider, whether it's Ethernet, whether it's over a hybrid fiber coax or over twisted pair, putting and mixing signals on the same wire of two different providers is going to cause a ton of reliability issues. In some cases, it just doesn't work. So that can't be done, which then it goes to, well, we need new wires. Is the conduit there? To do that wiring, it is so hard. Again, I was sharing with somebody here this morning. I have an MDU situation that I own a unit, and we had to, in 1980s, and we had to replace all the coax just to get good, reliable, high-speed data because of the environment the building's in. Very tough. It's very, very expensive. You think about, as Pierre said, how complex it is going through walls, trying to do it neatly, not interfering with the tenants. It's just extremely disruptive. So even if there's conduit, it's not necessarily easy. You're still going to be making holes in the walls of tenants' units. They aren't going to like that. And then that's what, when looking at the different technologies that are out there, you don't want to do wire sharing. So you want to use the wires that are there. There are different wires there. So I think it's a good place to hand it over to Pierre, where the wires you can use and take advantage and deliver service depending on what's in place and have multiple options.
Yeah, so to Sandy's point, the easiest wiring to use is definitely the telephone wiring, because every pair is independent from the other, although they're in the same binder, the same cable. There are ways to mitigate impact of one service versus the other. When we go on coax, it is feasible. It is being done right now. We have customers doing this. It requires a little bit more planning, but definitely it can be done, and it is being done. What I'd like to go back is a bit on less on the technology and some element about a point to Jenna. It says the shareholder value says that focus on the more affluent neighborhoods because you get more of your money back. What we're seeing is, and that there's something interesting from New Street Research that has kind of put a dollar value for the shareholders on a broadband subscriber. So someone that can get up to a gigabit, and it's about $4,000 to the shareholder value of an entity, or versus if someone is served with lower speed, it's a couple $100. So there's that incentive for any carrier to say the value of my business will go up that much higher if I can offer gigabit speeds to anyone. And sometimes people say, well, it means it can only be done with fiber. And now with fiber extension technologies, you bring fiber to the building and then reuse the wiring, you achieve the same top line enhancement. And then for the very low income buildings, there's this emergency broadband subsidy. I think it's up to $50 per subscriber per month. With fiber extension technologies like the one we offer, within a few months, you've recovered your investment into enabling each and every door of the MDU to deliver gigabit speeds. So that is now changing the dynamic in two ways. One is the actual investment required, which is much less and can be covered by the EBB. And then on the other end of the spectrum is you generate so much value for your customers. So there's going to be a double incentive now for the operators to go out, even in the low-income buildings, and do this investment. And we're starting to see that with some of our customers that are going back to these buildings that didn't pass a test and now are able to change the RRI, so the IRR, and then get away with it and now be able to improve their ability. They all want to offer more services to more doors. Now we give them a mean to achieve that. And the subsidies are certainly fantastic.
I know Jenna wants to weigh in on this wiring question and maybe offer some other thoughts. Go ahead, Jenna.
Yeah, I think there's just one thing that I want to draw a distinction with, which is, I think, Sandy is talking about sharing in-use wires. And there's a distinction between in-use wiring that a different provider is actively using to give service to a consumer and wiring that they own in the building that's not in use. And in fact, that was what we saw at issue in the San Francisco case, is the FCC very narrowly preempted the use of only in-use wiring, not out-of-use wiring. And so, I think there's a lot less to be argued that service will be reduced if another provider is using out of use wiring. And so lumping all of that together, I think, is somewhat unfair. So I want to draw that distinction. Just to say, if you're using someone else's out of use wiring, it's not interfering with the quality of service. I think there's an open question about the, interruption in service for sharing in use wiring. That I think the FCC should look into. The other thing I just want to note is we, public knowledge, this shameless plug time, we have been working with Consumer Reports on a tool that I'll put in the chat. And it's saying that if you live in a multi-dwelling unit, if you've experienced having just one provider available, share your story with the FCC while their docket is open. I believe so far we've gotten almost 1,000 people who have submitted comments to the FCC through this. So if this is something that you've experienced, or someone that has experienced it and they want to share their story with the FCC, certainly appreciate you weighing in on that docket, and I'll put the link in the chat.
Great, thank you. And for those who are watching on other channels, because in addition to Zoom, we stream this on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, and of course on Broadband Breakfast. We will put any other link that any of you want to provide, Kevin or Sandy or Pierre, to additional resources, and we will include that link that Jenna has just put in the chat window for those in Zoom. Let's kind of round up. Okay, this is a bit complicated topic. Normally we try to get to a little more consensus than we perhaps have in this discussion, but I want to come back to what I started the question answer period, which is that if we've got these three goods, which is getting higher capacity broadband, let's just say gigabit up and down, more competition, so there's more choices for consumers, and the smart buildings, the smart services. Make your closing argument, okay? And we'll go in the same order we started with. Why is your position the right one to achieve each of those three goals of higher capacity internet, competition, and better services throughout the building? So let's just go Kevin, Jenna, Sandy, and Pierre again.
Sure. I think, in closing, I think the existing structure of market-based partnership agreements is working. It's serving both our residents on the multi-family side and our commercial and retail tenants well across the multi-tenant environment. Capacity, something clearly our owners are very much committed to. It's why we're dedicating significant resources on the development and on the rehabilitation side of properties. It's, we talk about gigabit. That is a buzzword that residents know and are increasingly hoping for. And where possible, our owners are working to deliver that or better. I think we have a lot of room to grow there, and we're happy to see progress. Competition, again, I don't know how many times I can beat this drum, but it exists. Where it doesn't exist, it's a market failure, because that's where providers are unable to go, either because of geography or because they can't make the numbers work on their side of the equation. I think that's a public policy problem that we join Jenna in saying that the FCC needs to pay more attention to that market and likely dedicate subsidy. And smart buildings, smart tech, I think that is the underpinning of all of this. Consumer technology trends and preferences have shifted to a point where our owners know that both property operations, everything from energy efficiency to leak detection and so on, to access control and smart tech lighting and energy efficiency stuff in an apartment home is absolutely essential. And it's why connectivity is also important on the property operations side of the equation. But at the end of the day, it's seamless connectivity across the board, across multi-tenant environments. It's why we take it so seriously. And I think we're well suited by the existing market structure we have today.
Jenna, your turn.
At the end of the day, I think competition is going to bring us not only competition, but higher quality internet and smart buildings. I think the reality is that if a provider knows that they have to compete, they're going to offer better service, whether that's through faster broadband, whether that's better customer service, so you're not waiting on hold for 9 years. They don't have a monopoly. They have to win over their customer base. And so they're going to compete better. And then it also gives consumers the choice to pick what's best for them. I think we don't want to overlook the fact that consumers matter just as much as business profits, if not more so, I would say. Consumers should be able to pick what they want. They should be able to pick the service that is faster, that's cheaper, that just, does whatever they're looking for in a service, even if it's just that the consumer likes the name better and that's what they want to go with. That is their prerogative and we should give it to them. I think most consumers don't base their decision on that. They base it on speeds and quality of service. So I think that bringing competition to the marketplace will get us this faster service. It obviously brings in competition and it helps buildings do what they need to do to be smart.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being with us and representing the position you have here. Sandy, what are your thoughts? Close out on these 3 points I raised.
Well, as far as 1 gigabit, 90% of people have broadband services today. So
download speeds of 1 gigabit. What about upload speeds of 1 gigabit?
Well, that is in the process, especially as we look to go to 10G. But it's definitely the technology's in place, the infrastructure's there and working to be expanded to provide that. There's also a competition, just as Kevin shared, and I just can't get over this enough. When you look at it, most buildings have 2 providers. The majority have it there. And third, it's all about the technology. You must have broadband to do all the things you've mentioned about how buildings get smart, become efficient. And it's there. The broadband subsidies, as Pierre mentioned, are also really helping to get broadband further and extend the reach to get to the rest of that 10%.
Well, thank you again for being with us. Pierre, closing thoughts before I close us out.
Yeah, so thank you, Drew, and to the other panelists. It was very insightful to hear all these different point of views. Basically, we're here to turn copper into glass. That's kind of our motto, is glass is what people think that fiber is the be-it-all, and it's a fantastic technology. There's never enough fiber out there in the street along that can be used then to extend services. And we believe that having access to our type of technology does foster competition. Monkey Brains acquired a company called Common Networks in the Bay Area, and that was using our technology. So they were doing something very similar. And we have lots of other innovative new operators that have just surfaced in the last year or two addressing this exact need. And everyone is focused on, okay, I need faster bandwidth to the unit, to the apartment, which is great. But to Kevin's point, turning these buildings into smarter buildings with better heat control or cooling control, better security and all that, that doesn't need a lot of bandwidth, but it needs the right bandwidth where the wiring does exist today. So being able to reuse the wiring to control the overall operation of the building will bring about cost savings for the building owner, a better environment for the tenants, and ultimately helping reduce this CO2 footprint that we are all facing out there. So the competition of having the copper that becomes like glass-like to deliver these services suddenly becomes an enabler. And we have lots of other partners that are smarter than us about IoTs and all that. That is a whole topic in itself, but that is important to bring up older buildings to be kind of able to deliver the same services as a brand new building being erected now.
Well, thank you for that perspective. And just before we close, I want to remind everyone, and I made an error earlier, we want to thank each of our sponsors for contributing to permit us to do these events. They include Broadband.Money, Broadband Now, California Emerging Technology Fund, Lit Communities, Positron Access, Powerhouse Management. Thank you so much to Powerhouse. I forgot to mention them earlier. Render Networks, Samsung Electronics America, and Utopia Fiber. On behalf of Kevin Donnelly, Jenna Leventoff, Sandy Howe, Pierre Trudeau, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. Invite you to come back and join us again next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Take care. See you next